Hello, it is 12 p.m. Eastern Time. The meetup has officially begun, and welcome to Design Systems Community. It is brought to you here by Design Systems Community Toronto chapter. I am your co-host, Enrico Sacchetti. I know I'm disguised as DSC Toronto, but believe me, I'm a human. I'm co-hosting today with Donna Vitan and our other co-hosts, Varun Jain and Lucy List. We welcome you all to this Twitter space. I'm going to keep the intro brief, and we'll get to our guest speakers today. We have Esther, James, and Mike. So, like I said, welcome to Design Systems Community. And here we're going to be discussing applied design tokens. Today's event is sponsored by Rankle.io. Thank you for your continued support and for allowing us to bring more design systems content to all of you. Some quick housekeeping. We have a code of conduct, which is enforced in this space. Let's all be kind to each other and grow and learn together. You may see details of our code of conduct on the website, designsystems.community. Another special announcement, we've hit over 5,000 meetup.com members worldwide, not just in the Toronto chapter, but all Design Systems Community chapters. Congratulations to all of you. And we also hit 1,000 Twitter followers worldwide across all Design Systems Community chapters. Wow. Thank you so much for participating in events like this one. Once our guests have each had a turn to speak, we'll open up the space for some audience participation, where all of you will be able to have a chance to talk to our guests, ask questions around this topic, or bring up a related topic and share it with everyone here. Please be sure to request to speak from the Twitter app, and myself and our hosts will invite you when appropriate. And let us open the door to the floor. Passing it to Donna.
Welcome. Hi, I'm Donna. I am a design technologist at TELUS Digital that's leading our design systems in the organization. I'm really happy to help host this panel of amazing experts. So I just want to get started. We will have our guests introduce a little bit about themselves, but to kind of set the floor, I just wanted to share kind of my understanding and definition of a design token, and then maybe as you introduce yourself, you could add what is a design token to you. So a design token to me is a single source of truth that has a name and a value that captures a brand's design decisions in a very minute, agnostic way that can be leveraged in design tools and implementation across the board. So that is, I believe, the tiniest definition. So what is it? What are design tokens to you? And I'm gonna hand it off to Esther.
Thank you, Donna. Let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Esther. I'm based out of India, and I am currently working with Mike and Jan on Figma Tokens. I have my background in product management, but for the last couple of years, I've been diving deeply into design systems and even more deeply into design tokens. And I've been working on pushing the boundaries of a fully tokenized design system, and specifically a headless design system, which can be used for multi-brands. So that's a bit about myself. And if I say what is my definition of a design token, I guess I would say that it's the smallest design decision that encapsulates a brand and which can be used by both designers and developers, and which can actually bring about more collaboration between the two teams. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Mike, again, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike. Yeah, I've been, a creative technologist for a little over 20 years now. I've spent most of my professional life on the intersection of design, technology, business, innovation. Always somewhere in the middle. I had my hands in a lot of things. Traditionally, I've been running more of a product engineering, digital agency, and done that for over 10 years. But the last couple of years, I've been working a lot more in the design system space. I've always been really fascinated about the whole concept of being able to build underlying systems under design, under technology frameworks, and those kind of things. So yeah, design systems have always been like an area of passion. Yeah, and like Esther mentioned, for the last couple of years, we've been focusing more on the tooling end in design systems, design tokens, and yeah, the last 1.5, 2 years, like really actively involved in building Figma tokens and some other really cool stuff that's going to come up. Yeah, to bring design tokens to the design space as well. Yeah, what is the design token? Obviously, we can define it in a very simple way, but I think what design tokens mean to me is the glue between design and engineering right now. That kind of ties it all together in this sort of elegant way that we didn't really have before. But yeah, now yeah, so it's collaboration. That's kind of what it is for me between design and engineering. So yeah, thank you. Word back to you.
Share a little bit about yourself and maybe talk off design tokens.
Okay, next up is James.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, you were audio problems. Hi everyone. I'm James. Really excited to be here, and thanks to the host for inviting me. Similar to Mike, I have a mixed background. Once upon a time, I was a developer, then I was a designer, and then I kind of ended up somewhere in the middle, and I kind of like it there. So that's where I've been the past few years, and it's in that kind of no man's land that I stumbled into the world of design systems and sort of fell in love with that, to the point that I'm probably a little obsessed with them, if I'm honest. And I'm currently working at JP Morgan in one of their design system teams, where I'm a community and support manager. And I'm obliged to give the standard corporate disclaimer that any opinions I share here today are my own and not representative of my employer, blah, blah, blah. But in my spare time, I'm also a member of the Design Tokens community group, where I'm one of the format editors. And I guess we'll probably talk about that a little more later on. So what are design tokens to me? I kind of agree with all the definitions so far. I mean, like Donna, I really like that expression of that phrase, design decisions, that they kind of capture and name design decisions. And I think it's the collaboration that they enable that is the kind of the power, and a big part of that is the shared vocabulary, right? But the act of naming those design decisions means that across different disciplines within your team, or even outside of your team, you start to speak the same language. So that's, I guess that's what they are to me. Cool.
Okay, thanks everybody. So it's great to kind of see what everybody is currently working on. And I think one of the things that we were interested in is really from the different roles and the different things that you do, like how do design tokens benefit, like you said, like that collaboration between design and developer, but how do design tokens benefit designer and developer flows? If you can dive a little bit into that. Who would like to pick it up first? Okay, I saw James first, so please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, well, I guess I touched on it a moment ago, right? I think creating that shared language is a huge step, and where you're handing over designs or things like that, it's helpful, because whereas in the past you might have had to annotate designs and sort of spec out the color codes, the exact dimensions for margins and paddings and font sizes and all that kind of stuff, now you can just refer to them by name, right? This is space large, this is padding medium, this is brand primary color, or whatever. And part of that, if you have the right tooling set up as well, is you kind of reduce the margin of error. So whereas when you had explicit values, people would have to generally copy paste those in some way, or maybe use an eyedropper for colors and things like that, and that little discrepancies and mistakes can creep in. But now with design tokens, it's not just the name, but those things are then represented potentially as variables in code or styles in a design tool like Figma. And so whatever your discipline is, you can kind of just use those things. You don't, and you almost forget about what the underlying value is, which I think is helpful because, you know, space medium is probably a lot more meaningful than 16 pixels or some arbitrary number. And I think, you know, what we're seeing a lot of now with a lot of design systems is things like different modes, like light and dark mode, or information densities, or different brands. And design tokens can be the enabler for that sort of thing. And I think part of that is, again, this abstraction of like, you're thinking in terms of the meaning rather than what value it happens to be. And so then when that value maybe changes because it's dark mode or something like that, it doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about it, right? You can just keep on working. So I think, yeah, for me, that's kind of a big part of it. But yeah, let's hear someone else.
Thanks, James. And I think Mike wanted to top up.
Well, yeah, I think James was pretty complete over there. I think, you know, if I want to add like a few keywords to that, right? Maybe not just about improving workflows, right, but increasing confidence in a solid process, right? I think if you think about releasing, you know, design tokens bring about, or they're supposed to be bringing about a lot of confidence, right? We can do things in a much more structured way. There are no hidden there are no hidden variables, right? There are no unexpected things happening most of the time. So I think that's a really cool thing, you know, where design tokens really help. And like James mentioned, you know, the aspect of theming or introducing a new theme, right? So having this layer of abstraction in the middle, you know, and being able to actually, like, you know, create layers, right, outside, you know, of design or engineering itself per se, right, in this sort of middle layer is really elegant. And then also more so, and that's probably one of the reasons why I really started putting effort in Figma tokens. But this is not just a Figma tokens subject; it's broader in the context of all, you know, designer creation tools, right? Is that you know, design tokens are now also available to designers, right? It was kind of a really odd situation before where designers had to think about design tokens, but they couldn't use design tokens. It was an engineering thing, right? And now it's coming into the tooling, right? So I think that is amazing because, like, it's no longer you know, this thing that is only living in your code base, but it's actually you know, creating an opportunity to have a bidirectional synchronization of decision making, right? So it's not just a one-way street anymore. Like, changes in engineering can come back into design, changes in design can come back in you know, to engineering, and almost effortlessly, right? With so much confidence and so much of yeah, you know, sort of a sure process. So yeah, I think that's really cool. Yeah.
Cool. So I wanted to maybe, Esther, if you have something else to add on here, and I think we were kind of just trying to answer what are the benefits for designer and developer flow for that design tokens provide.
I think James and Mike has covered most of the things, and I would just like to add that design tokens being able to be used by designers in design, I think that has kind of enabled designers to kind of also see what are the changes they are doing, or what are the kind of how the decisions are affecting affecting the whole pipeline, right? So if the pipeline is built correctly or fully, then you can see like any change in any design token reflecting onto your design and onto your code as well. So that is, I think, what Mike also spoke about, the bidirectional sync that is happening between design and development. I think that is a very powerful thing that design tokens has brought in. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. So we want to open it up to the audience about if you have any questions for our experts here who are, defining design token standards, have been using design tokens, and kind of really see the benefits between the designer, developer, and the collaboration flows. So if you have questions, hands up and we can invite you.
Correct. If you raise your hand here in Twitter Spaces, we'll add you to our front stage, and you can speak with us with your experiences, not necessarily questions, but what you'd like to share with everyone too. And that's okay because we ourselves have a lot to discuss too. For example, integrating tokens end to end. This is something that I can talk about for a few seconds. I was working at a startup a year ago, and we had a part-time designer on our team, and I was sort of insisting that we had design tokens in our code base. And it was mostly half experimental, but half hopeful for best practices. And what I ended up building was I found a Figma plugin, and it was something along the lines of design tokens, and their implementation involved option tokens and decision tokens. I'm not sure if that's a popular nomenclature today, but that's what I experimented with a year ago. And what we ended up building was a JavaScript file containing option tokens, which are the colors and spacing and typography that our application used. And then we had another JavaScript file with decision tokens. And those decision tokens included the actual applied use of those option tokens. So in code, in components, and on actual pages, we only consumed decision tokens. And then the decision tokens only consumed option tokens. And I thought that worked well, but there was one big problem. We did not have a full-time designer who had the time to give their input. So it felt wrong that a development team was making all of these choices and infrastructure without adequate input from a design team or even a designer. So it makes me wonder, is there such a thing as implementing design tokens too soon for a team? Especially in my example where I was at a startup and the team was really, really small and the code base was somewhat a throwaway code base just to get up and running really quickly. Maybe that's the time I didn't need to spend. Mind you, it wasn't adding friction to development. I would just have to remind my development team, hey, that color orange wasn't in our decision tokens. You have to consume this color orange. Conversations like that helped because we had consistent use of color. So it benefited the development team. But the caveat was we didn't have a end-to-end flow. We didn't have a pipeline for designers to update those tokens and then bring them to development and vice versa. Like the bidirectionality that Mike and Esther brought up, we did not have that at the time. And that's something that I think would greatly benefit larger teams. But a startup only in the bare bones amount. So my question for the audience is, does anyone have small team experience with design tokens? Might be a tough one.
Yeah, I guess we'll let the audience warm up a little bit more, and then we'll have our guests help answer that question. Do you want to take it? Okay, Mike, we got Mike.
Yeah, sorry, I had trouble with my mic. But now I'm unmuted. Yeah, I think it's not an easy question to answer, right? Like when are design tokens too early? I think there's a lot of factors and a lot of teams that I'm working with or interacting with, right? I think it depends on also a level of how comfortable is the team with it, right? If design tokens is a new concept for a team, then probably very early on is not the right time to start, right? Because you're especially if you're building a new product, right, and you're trying to iterate quick, you're pivoting, right? There's probably higher priorities that you want to focus on, right? Unless the people who are designing and coding are like super comfortable with it, and it's creating an efficiency gain for them, right? And even in the time, if in the context of a design system, right? Like, are you building a new design system? But for what, right? Is it a new product? Are you still exploring a lot, or is it a well-established product, but are you starting a new design system? Regardless of if you're a small or a large team, right? So I think design tokens can, again, then, that's sort of the next level of abstraction and consistency. I think if you're well on your way, and your product is stable, and then you're starting a new design system you don't have one yet, right? Yeah, I think very early on is the right time to start talking about design tokens, because that's probably a great place to start, right? And kind of index everything. But if you're still exploring, I often find it slows you down. And even in our own development and in our own product development, right? To be very fair, even though we're building tooling for design tokens, right? They really don't come at first when we're experimenting, or when we're still in early stages, right? They come in later, once we find our way, once we really know what we're doing, and then they really start making sense when you start moving towards more consistency, towards maintenance, right? And that's where they really start becoming real handy, right? But again, if you have like a solid brand definition already, at least your core, right, could be well defined in design tokens. But things like semantics, they usually take some time to really come out and arise in form of clarity, right? So yeah, I think that's what I would add here.
Okay, awesome. Esther, I think you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I think I agree with Mike when he says that when you're in the initial phase of designing or exploring, designs tokens might not be the first thing that you jump into, right? You are still in that phase of exploring and figuring out. And then but it might not be, I mean, they're like two different things, I would think, that thinking about design tokens and implementing them. Maybe you could start thinking about design tokens so that you can think about consistency and scaling as you as you start building, right? But implementing them could come later when you are more stable in your approach, or in your product, or in your design. And I think the same goes for design system as well. And yeah, what I guess I would like to reiterate that it also depends, right? Is it like a brand or a product that you're building from scratch, or is it something that is well established? So I think it's very based on the situation. Yeah.
Thanks, Esther. So I agree, right? Like at first you kind of want to define the global tokens for the brand or product, but then also you're defining tokens that you're actually using in the project that you're implementing or the thing that you're working on. So it's really hard to decide where, no, these tokens are going to be the thing that everyone uses. It's like, well, I'm not using that yet. I'm only using like these certain things. And so you kind of have to decide when do you go the global way, or when do you get to the specific way. And I think James, you wanted to top off on this as well, again, the integration of tokens end to end.
Right, yeah. I think I wanted to pick up on something that Enrico said right at the start. So I really like the thing you mentioned about how in his project they had this the decision tokens, which by the sound of it is kind of what we might call like a semantic tier of tokens, and that those were the only things that were allowed to be used downstream in the components. So it's kind of like this barrier between the options and the actual components. And if you think about it in code terms, that's kind of like an API, right? Just like the props you might have on a component or something like that. And like any other API, eventually you want it to stabilize and be reliable, and so that your consumers can use it, and you don't break their code every time you do a new release. But at the same time, it's kind of impossible to anticipate every edge case, every scenario. So there's inevitably, I think, as you start doing this, there's going to be some experimentation, there's going to be some churn, there's going to be essentially a sort of a discovery phase until you reach that point. So I think it makes sense for teams to be thinking about this and playing with this sooner rather than later, but maybe not worrying too much about it being getting it right first time, because you won't, right? And just kind of accepting that it's something that will sort of evolve and mature, but when it does, it'll be good. So from a sort of I guess from a tooling and a setup point of view, I do what, and I'm speculating a little bit here too, if I'm honest, but I wonder whether it's actually worthwhile to sort of try and set that stuff up pretty quickly. So if you get, by whatever means, some sort of integration between your design tool, your development environment, and have a place where you can kind of capture whatever your current state of the tokens is, then I think that's a good starting point, because that can enable that experimentation, right? You've got the infrastructure in place, and then you can start playing with the actual, the tokens that you push through that infrastructure. And I guess another thing I wanted to share was, so the team I'm in right now, right, we have, and it's an internal design system, but it serves quite a large audience, and it's been around for a while. And we kind of had tokens for a while, but we're going through a major refactor at the moment. And as part of that, we're sort of tidying up and architecting, I guess, say, our design tokens. And it's been a really interesting exercise, because it's actually uncovered a lot of weird inconsistencies and sort of odd choices in our componentry, where we've got in the effort to sort of try and create that stable API, we've realized we've got these things and they're kind of different, but maybe they shouldn't be. And so it's that what started out as like just cleaning up tokens ended up being a way of sort of refining and systematizing our design more thoroughly, so which is really valuable. So yeah, I guess whether you're starting out or small, or whether you're a huge corporation like where I work, then it's never too early and never too late either. Yeah. Cool.
That's really cool. I think we have a couple of people that want to add to that, and I think I just wanted to kind of come in and say, like, it's really interesting, right? Like, once you start defining all these different design tokens, then that creates the opportunity to be like, hey, is it time to audit? Is it time to, like, why are you creating all these? Like, why do we have so many, and do we need them? So I think that's a really great way to capture at that point. Enrico, you wanted to?
Sure. Also, thank you, Ollie, for raising your hand. We'll bring you in momentarily. Yeah, thank you, James and Esther and Mike, for talking to the example I gave at a startup. Of course, it's out of the scope of this conversation to really go deep into the determination of taking on good technical debt and what is appropriate for your needs in the context you work in at the given scope of time. But I did, at the time, I did have a designer who did establish a very good starting point of a design system. That's what they worked on and gave us heading levels, spacing levels, colors. They actually handed that off in a Figma file. But as I mentioned, they were part-time, so they couldn't spend too much time focusing on design tokens creation. So I only went as far as making the option tokens, which were obvious and handed to us. And then I worked with the development team to come up with a set of decision tokens that our app could consume. And some of the good things that came from that is later discovering that border outlines weren't high enough contrast. And all we had to do was change one decision token to choose a better option color. And that updated the border contrast for all our buttons across the app. So that was really cool, because I didn't go so far off the deep end to make a dark theme and other stuff, although we could do that. At least we took the minimal design decision tokens, as we called them, and that helped our app grow in a very easy way without taking on too much debt. So yeah, of course, it depends on the context you're under. So with that said, Ollie, I believe you are welcome to share some ideas with us.
Oh, thank you. So I work at a company that's got probably about 40 engineers. At the moment, we have no plans, and probably will never have a native app, like an iOS app or an Android app. We're always just going to be for the web. And so for us, being able to share CSS variables is across different code bases is already quite easy without needing to abstract that into JSON. It can just exist just as CSS, and you can install CSS and import CSS, and it's all quite simple. And I think utilizing JSON and like the build step of converting JSON into CSS would add, if we went that route, a certain amount of complexity. And because we are only a sort of web-based product, I think the only thing that has made me interested in design tokens is the prospect of using them in design tools like Figma and possibly Adobe products. But I suppose it still feels like something that's very much in progress. We are doing a bit of a rewrite of our front end at the moment, so would be kind of the ideal time to start utilizing tokens if we're going to go down that route. But I just feel very kind of cautious about it, really, and about how easy it will actually be. It's the kind of thing that sounds amazing in theoretically, but then once you come to implementing it, can be quite hard. Yeah. So if anyone has thoughts about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Ollie. Like, that's a really great question, right? Like, you kind of are interested in doing design tokens, but it is a lot of overhead for the process that you have. And I think we'll have Mike kind of give his insight.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, you already have design tokens, right? Like, let's not get too confused about it in that sense, right? If you're using CSS variables and you have some semantic meaning attached to those variables, right? Then I think you're well on your way of a design token implementation. They may not be in a JSON format, but that's really not the point here, right? The JSON format is an attempt to standardize how we store them. It's not the concept itself. Then on the only thing that comes to mind for me, right? And again, it depends on your organization, but I think this will always be true. One thing that I really like about being able to have your design tokens stored in a more agnostic way is not just because of portability to other technology stacks, but maybe also creating a place of shared ownership over these design decisions, right? And like you rightfully said, we are now opening the doors, right, to use these in design tools, and in the future, that gamma of tools that we can use may be much larger. I think of like motion tokens and being able to use those in motion design software, right? So it will really open up the doors for a brand to place these actually brand decisions, right? Identity decisions, across different tooling that's being used. And I think that's really powerful. Also being able to enable your design team to author these tokens in an environment that they are comfortable in, and be co-authors in the process. I think, is one step towards better collaboration between design and engineering, and creating sort of a feeling of shared ownership, and empowering designers, right, who may not be so comfortable with code, to be a part of that process. And I think whenever we, push for, creating a common ground between design and engineering, or any two teams, right, good things happen, right? So I think that's another consideration apart from just the, technological challenges. And also the tooling that is there right now, especially if you're working on web, right? And after Danny Banks created the amazing style dictionary library for us, which we all so happily use in our pipelines. I think the challenges are fairly limited. Even converting CSS variables back to JSON with a simple pipeline, right? I've seen some of our users who already had a sophisticated design token library in CSS or SAS, and they're actually having a pipeline from there to JSON, right, to expose it back to design initially, and then maybe slowly that turns around. So that's another route that you could consider. I'm not saying that is potentially the best route, but it might be a way to give your design team insight into these tokens, right? The library that exists before you even start collaborating on it or making the pipeline more complicated.
Thanks, Mike. James, I think you wanted to add a little bit on again, like Mike said, design tokens, whether it's CSS variable or JSON, as long as you're collecting them. Yeah.
Exactly. I think Mike's actually already covered some of what I was going to say, but yeah, I would definitely echo that, you don't get hung up on, I suppose, how you capture or express your tokens in code. So if you're doing CSS variables and that works for you, that's cool. You've still got tokens. I know Gina Ann, who pioneered the concept of design tokens, is fond of talking about it more as of a methodology rather than a sort of a thing, as it were. So yeah, you're kind of practicing the methodology already by the sound of it. That being said, as Mike already said, I think I would say, if I'm a big fan of keeping things simple. So if CSS variables works for you right now and meets your needs, then don't, that's cool. No need for anything else. However, if there comes a point where perhaps you want to be able to expose those to designers in whatever tools they happen to be using, or if you have, I don't know, a documentation site or possibly sort of other places, and those might also include non-obvious things. So like years ago, I worked on I guess it was more of a proof of concept thing, but we played around with like exporting our color tokens as color palette files that you could load into the macOS color picker, which was then kind of made them available in things like Preview and PowerPoint and Keynote and so on, which meant that, folks making slide decks could use the same colors we were using in our UIs. You can potentially play with stuff like that. So there may be value at some point in kind of migrating your tokens to JSON or the standard format once that exists. Sorry, I can't help but plug it. But yeah, don't sweat it if now's not the right time. And when that time comes, like Mike already said, there may well be tools out there that can automate that process for you. So yeah.
Mike, I think, did you want to add another top off?
No, I think we got it all covered here on this one.
Okay, I'll add a note. Ollie, you just jogged my memory. So you mentioned CSS and targeting web. That is a very important context to bring up. For the example I gave at the startup, I was already in a React Native code base, which means I was targeting iOS, Android, and web. I had a single code base targeting 3 SKUs. And the interesting thing about that is my styles had to be defined in JavaScript because React Native does not allow regular CSS. So on one hand, I had a complex code base, but on the other hand, it was kind of effortless to implement tokens because I was already using JavaScript for my styles. So what's interesting about that is I didn't have to spend a whole day or two coming up with a tokens pipeline. I just wrote something in under an hour and I added it to the code base so that my team of 3 developers could consume it right away. So I guess under that context, it made sense to make a very minimal design tokens system for my team. But I can understand how under web, you might need to implement CSS variables, which is a fantastic way to do tokens. I love CSS variables. But depending on the size of your designer team, maybe the level of governance can be touch and go where they quickly sync up with you and say, hey, let's update this. And maybe that's good enough depending on the stage you are in your company. So, Ollie, I hope our team here answered some of your questions. By the way, everyone else, feel free to join us in the speaker deck. Ollie, what do you think?
Yeah, great answers. Thank you. I think because I am somebody that codes and does design as well, there's not a pressing need for me to adopt JSON at the moment, because I think that whole kind of issue of variables getting out of sync in designing code is something that probably the easiest way to avoid that is to hire somebody that is able to have at least enough coding knowledge to be able to just update some simple variables in a file, as well as keep track at least of a Figma library. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a sort of a technical solution to that, because I have tried the Specify app, I think it's called, and I did find it quite. I mean, it's certainly early days, and I think it'll improve, but it did seem not the easiest thing in the world to use. So, but
Yeah.
I've yeah.
No, it's very fair, right? Like if you're in a small team and you're also one of the few people who design and code as well, like you've got it on lock. And it's really when your team gets bigger or when you need to share those things that these things kind of make more sense. So I think maybe I have a question for, again, everyone feel free to chime in. But Esther and Mike, you're building this bridge for the design tool to kind of help implement or create these design tokens to help more of that design collaboration with the development kind of thing. I think my question is really like whether or not the design tools are integrated or are already importing or exporting tokens, like how do you see, again, having your history with design tools and to see what you're currently working on, maybe the future of what you want design tools to do, even if they're not integrated with code, what are the benefits of design tokens in the design flow?
Yeah, like I think there are many, right? And I think the most interesting thing is that like we are widening now the amount of decisions that we can use, right? And also again in design tools there were already tokens, right? We often call them styles, right? And they were a simple form of tokens, but it's nothing really new, right? So I think the new layer that's being added on is the layering in the tokens, right? That we can now bring in, bringing relationships between tokens or adding a larger number of decisions that we can tokenize. And I think that's really exciting. It's also really exciting to see that more and more tools are adopting or embracing the concept of variabilizing, tokenizing, right, decisions. But if you think about it, like in our industry and with our, I mean, like the context of design systems and product design tools, it's a really new thing, but it's nothing new, right? Like CAD/CAM software has been doing this for like 40 years, right, or 30 years, I don't know, from the time it started, right? Nobody is doing industrial design or design. No architect is designing like a 40-story apartment building without parameterized and tokenized design, right? So I think we are also kind of learning to borrow smart concepts, like even in 3D CG, right? Those concepts have been there for ages, right? So for me, it's really interesting to see like how do we tie all these worlds together now from the context of a brand, right? Because from the tooling perspective, it's a matter of technical integration, but it's more like how do we tie it all together in the context of a brand, right? And what does it mean? Because we're not just talking about design systems and mostly just web and maybe mobile apps and stuff like that. But then there's so much more, right? That connects a brand and an identity through all these different channels. And think about headless channels. Think about like the AR, VR that is coming into the picture, right? And headless interfaces like voice, right? So how far is this going to go, both in the design and like animation, motion, right? So what I'm really excited about more than anything is to see that how can we create this sort of centralized place to capture a brand's identity, right, and expose this in a very atomic way to all those people who are creating experiences in all these different places, regardless of what platform you're designing for or what media you're designing for. It can be print as well, right? We're not even thinking about that properly, but in design tokens, right? Right now, all colors are digital in the RGB space, right? Like, how are we going to deal with tools that are dealing with Pantone colors or CMYK, right? So yeah, that evolution, there's a lot to come, I think, in the bigger thinking of what does this mean, right? Because the design system space has kind of triggered this design token terminology for this particular part of the problem statement. But then in the context of a brand, the problem statement is way larger, right? And I'm excited to see how that's going to play out. So maybe I didn't answer your question entirely in the same direction, but yeah, that's kind of the thought that it triggered.
We're getting aspirational.
Yeah.
Esther, I think you wanted to add to that.
Yeah. So I think in that context, design tokens, for me specifically, and for the design system community, um, right? It's, I think, being able to capture those decisions and have them as like a single source of truth. And specifically at Figma Tokens, what we aim to do is to have this single source of truth, which is owned by you, basically. So it can reside in any place that you want it to be, which is agnostic of your technology, which is agnostic of your design tool, hopefully in the future. And being able to have your brand encapsulated in design tokens, right? And whatever may be the shifting trends in tools or platforms that we are using right now, that ownership is always with you as a brand. So I think I'm not sure if I'm answering the question directly, but I think that is what, like, the importance of design tokens. I would like to point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think agnosticism is a really interesting one, right? Because there's a new kid on the block, every few months, every few years, right? Now it's Figma, and there's so many tools, but um, yeah, I think, it's so important at some point also to have this sort of sense of ownership on your design data, and having this portability, right? To be able to like introduce new tools and basically to use the tools that you need to do the job, right? For the right tools for creating the right kind of experience. And if you're heavily invested into an ecosystem that's owned by a corporation, right, and all your data is locked in there, that's extremely scary to me. Yeah, so I think Esther made a really good point there, that, like, being able to become the owner of your design data on the most fundamental level is I think really powerful.
Yeah, but thanks for sharing that. Like you're right, right? Like it's not about the design tool or even the different projects of implementation. As long as you can kind of carry those design tokens with you wherever you need. And so I think, James, I have a question for you, which I think is going to be interesting, right? Like if we're talking about let's carry our design tokens. This is our brand. Here's our design tokens. I think I think before in one of your talks, you kind of get into like where else can you carry design tokens? You know, what are some things that we're talking about Figma, we're talking about like implementation in CSS right now, but where else do you see design tokens being used?
Where don't I see them being used? I I think Mike already touched on some of this earlier, right? Like there's I think most design systems today primarily deal with digital UIs, and those are primarily 2D interfaces on flat screens, right? Um, and I think we're seeing more and more interest in things like mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, and just sort of bringing, um, exploring, I guess, 3D UIs beyond, just games. And uh, there's, in a way, things may also come full circle, right? I mean, we've got more traditional media like print. There might be other things like TV and video. Essentially anything that has a visual element to it, where, and especially if you're a company who's got a brand and you presumably want to infuse all of those things with the brand to make them all kind of recognizable and coherent. Um, you know, essentially you want to be able to distribute your colors, your typography, or whatever it is that kind of makes up your identity, or is key to it, to as many places as possible. And I think design tokens are potentially the means of doing that. And I'm going to plug the standard format again. I'm sorry, but but like I think that's like the portability that Esther and Jan were talking about a moment ago. I think is really really important, right? Because tools do come and go, trends come and go, programming languages and frameworks fall in and out of favor. And for me, sort of with so much churn, it's like we don't talk enough in our industry, I think, about the sort of longevity. Like, how do we make things that last, that we can do today and still be confident that they'll probably be useful 5 years, 10 years from now. And I think standards are a huge part of that. I like to look to, the web, right? HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I could, if I stick to those standards, if I made a site 20 years ago, it will still work in a modern browser. I can still access it. And the cool thing is, if I build something today, I'm reasonably confident 20 years from now, I'll still be able to open it. And I don't think there's all that many things that can, if you think of like native apps or whatever, can you say the same thing about that? If you published an app to the App Store, like a native app 10 years ago, is that still going to run on the latest version of iOS? Probably not, right? And so when it comes to tokens, we've got different tools trying to exchange essentially the same thing. We've got potentially different places we would like that information to go. So it's just kind of screaming out for some standardization, and that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Design Tokens community group. And obviously, Donna, you're a fellow editor of the spec, so you know a lot about this too. And I guess for those that haven't already, I'd encourage you all to kind of have a look at that and chime in, because this, at the moment, it's still a draft. We're still figuring a lot of these things out. So we're, the more feedback we get, the more likely it's going to be fit for purpose. So please do kind of get involved. But I'm really pleased to see a lot of tool vendors and open source projects already showing an interest, already tinkering with the current draft spec, and so it feels like this. It's starting to happen. It's no longer like a theoretical, oh, wouldn't it be nice if all these things could talk to each other? It's actually starting to happen, which is for me super exciting, and I hope means that if you create tokens today, maybe 5-10 years from now, you'll still be able to use them. There'll be different tools, and they might be going to more places than they are today, but it's not wasted effort, as it were. So yeah.
Yep. Thanks, James. And again, everybody, feel free to look at our draft spec, and there's a lot of discussions in the GitHub as well. So check that out, the Design Tokens community group, because you're all very interested in design tokens. Thank you for joining us. You're probably using it right now, or maybe interested in implementing it, and this is a great time to kind of add your feedback, add your considerations as well. So thanks, James, for bringing that up. I know we're about 10 minutes till the end of our Twitter space, and we've kind of talked a little bit about, what worked, when is a good time to start your own token, what are you already collecting, kind of thing. And maybe this is a pretty big question, but maybe just to kind of trigger some inspiration and further discussion afterwards would be, okay, so you have a brand, you have your design tokens, but what if you're getting into the space of multi-brand, of theming? Esther, Mike, like you said, like you're creating this headless, kind of system, and it's enough to collect the design tokens, but then how do you define and then share and then have all these brands align on a shared set of tokens? Yeah, go ahead, Esther.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So I think at the core of it, right, when you're talking about multi-brand, when we're using design tokens and we are semantically defining decisions, that I think is at like the core of it, because you could have your brand, different brands which are very dynamic in, let's say, how the colors are or how the typography are. But I think I'll just like to share how we have worked with it and how we have thought about it. So we kind of think about like the core tokens or the global tokens, right, as being very dynamic from brand to brand. But when you come to the semantic tokens and you're trying to convey the meanings and you're connecting it back to the brand, that's where you can make like the connections, and the semantic meaning will not change. And then we can do another level of abstraction in terms of like component level tokens as well. So at one point, we have a very dynamic set of design tokens, which is like the brand. And then on the other side, on the other hand, you have the component level tokens, which would not change. And so like the connection, how you are connecting your components to the brand is being controlled by how you are semantically defining these colors or these decisions, right? So so that's how we have worked on it. And I think, yeah.
Thanks, Esther. Mike, I think you wanted to top up as well.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I think Esther kind of covered it, quite crisp and clear, right? That what I take from it is that on if you take it from left to right, from your core token to your and then to the semantic layer of tokens, right, or your alias tokens, your reference tokens, whatever you want to call it. And then moving towards component-specific tokens, right? And especially, I mean, there's obviously big debate on component-specific tokens and should we do it or not. But I think as soon as you reach the multi-brand design system topic, this becomes quite an interesting one. And I think, yeah, the interesting thing that Esther just mentioned was that, as you go from left to right on that scale, right, like things become more stable, right? So, of course, like a brand, if it's already defined, your core tokens are kind of going to be derived from, traditionally like a style guide, right? Yeah, but once you start thinking about your components, especially like a base component library, right? Because the design system, I mean, I think we are kind of reducing it to components in this area, right, of tokenization. Like, of course, design system is so much bigger than just that component library. But if you think about your base component library, especially atoms and molecules, right? Things are sort of finite, right? Even though like a button is a terribly complex component, at some point you reach a finite number of ways that it can be used and a finite number of use cases that are really attached to a button. So even though a brand can be vastly different, you can sort of freeze, I think. I mean, it's complex, but you can sort of freeze on a finite number of use cases that have to be supported by a base component, let's say a button, right? So how can we design so it becomes more interesting to think that how do we design an API on a component, right, that supports all the brand's use cases, and that's quite complex. But once you have that part figured out, right, the token structure emerges from that, right? Because especially when you think about like, that you have a component with a certain number of variants in a certain number of states, right? So the kind of the theme architecture in tokens sort of starts emerging from your component API architecture. And I think that's really interesting because that really creates a space that makes theming way more efficient, right? And let it be multi-brand or let it be multi-theme. I think multi-brand is just a complexion on top of multi-mode, for example, right? Light mode, dark mode, high contrast mode. Because there's more parameters that you're going to influence, right? Where in the one case it may be just color, and then suddenly you're moving to everything, right? From typography to your border radii to your spacing and whatnot. But yeah, like I think the multi-brand discussion really lives between component specific tokens, if you want to go there, and your set of core, right? And so yeah, I think that is really cool how this multi-tier architecture really enabled us to create this theming layer in the middle, which is sort of it's a set of connectors between the brand core decisions and the components inheriting them. Yeah. I think we're almost out of time, so let me give the word back to you guys.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Esther, and thank you, James. Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us. Enrico, did we have any wrap up?
Yeah, it's time for closing remarks. Thank you so much to our guests, James, Mike, Esther, and Donna, for hosting super duper well. Thank you for that. And this was a Design Systems community meetup. It is recorded. You can later see this in past recordings on our website, designsystems.community. We also have an RSS feed if you're into that. Subscribe if you have an e-reader. This talk about multi-brand also reminds me of a prior meetup where one of our former guests, Kalig from Shopify at the time, talked about automating high contrast color tokens for a multi-brand admin interface. You can check that out in our past recordings on designsystems.community/resources. Check it out, and thank you all for attending today. That is it. Goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
you too. Bye.